Anybody here for the first time tonight? Nice, welcome. Won't give you a pop quiz, right? So special thank you to our full season financial sponsors, North South Software. Matt is here. Yeah, thank you, Matt. To Microsoft and to RL Solutions, pens and some stickers are at the back if you want to grab some of those. As well, our swag sponsors, thank you to those people. We do have 4 prizes we're giving away. I'm going to save a bunch of prizes for next month, which is going to be our season end finale, and that's going to be our lightning round session. So if you haven't won anything yet, please come out to that, and you might have a chance to win some of the cool stuff that's left over. As always, please rate our meetup. All of our sponsors like to see how we're doing. It encourages them to sponsor us in the future if they know we're doing a good job. As well, we also have a jobs posting board. If anybody's looking for work or looking for workers, they want to stand up and they can say a few words, let me know. So traction on that one, so we'll keep going. A few upcoming events. Lori's going to be hosting a Xamarin plus IoT talk. Brandon Minnick, I don't know who that is.
He is a cloud developer advocate at Microsoft.
Okay.
And yeah, and his talk is going to be
Cool. Is he Canadian?
He is. He lives in Toronto.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, he doesn't. No, I was thinking of a different guy. He's flying into Toronto.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, he's the guy who thinks he's coming to Toronto, but he's really coming to Kitchener.
Yeah.
That's right. He's not even flying into Toronto. Joke's on him. Our next session and our last session of the season is going to be our lightning round sessions, June 13th. We are still looking for additional speakers. We've had a few people reach out to us. If you want to speak for anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes, you've got a topic, you want to talk about a development topic or a new tool that you like or something cool that you built, this is a chance for you guys to get your feet wet and do some public speaking. We're always looking for new speakers, so this is a way to kind of grow you into this role. Derek didn't start by doing 75-minute sessions. I'm sure he started small and worked his way up, so this is a way for other speakers to get their feet wet. So if you want to speak, reach out to us at cttdnug@gmail.com, or you can speak to me at the break, and we can talk about it further. A few other small minor meetups coming up. So Dave Lloyd is talking about SQL Server data tools, which he spoke about here, I think in January or February. That's at Obi's group, May 31st. There's a few more. There's NoSQL in Toronto. That's May 29th. And again, blockchain on May 22nd in Toronto. And WIPRO is going to be doing NanoServer. So if you're into the IT side and you want to learn more about NanoServer, you can check that out on May 28th. As well, there's HackerNest coming up. If you want to do some socializing among some geeks, you can check them out at HackerNest. As well, something we announced last month, Power of the Cloud, June 22nd. This is going to be at the Microsoft Canada headquarters. I don't also have the slide, but watch because there's going to be a build tour coming around this same time. It hasn't been announced yet, but there will be a build tour like they do always. It's an encapsulation of what they announced at Build this week. It will be coming to Toronto generally around the end of June. So watch for those announcements. Probably be next week when they are announced. And they're generally free at the Microsoft headquarters as well. It's a full day event if you feel like getting out of the office. All right, without further ado, let me introduce Derek. Derek is an MVP. Derek speaks a lot. He's spoken at CodeMash. He's spoken at other major conferences. He also runs the Windsor Essex.net user group, and you've been a developer for approximately 20 years? Yeah, cool. So is this a talk you did at CodeMash?
No, I did this one at Confu in Montreal.
Nice. Okay, well, without further ado, please welcome Derek.
Thanks. All right, so I'm Derek, obviously. First, before I get all into this stuff, everything I'm talking about is on my blog. Almost everything I blog about somewhat relates to this in some vein, or a piece of it relates to this in some vein. We'll go through it, but I'll mention the blog at the end. Some series of blog posts that I have that's very much directly related to this. So everything's on codeopinion.com. Context. I got to give some context about this talk because this is a pile of mistakes throughout my career that lead to kind of this. So I just want to talk about some of the stuff that I'm working on, what I've been working on over the last, say, 4 years. So you can just relate to the apps that I'm working on where this is applicable to, because this isn't something you just want to do everywhere. I'm going to talk a little more about that, but just a frame of reference so you can see apps I'm working on related to the type of apps you're working on, if you can relate in any way, and some of it, not all of it, some of it will be useful or not. So 4 years ago, I started working for a startup, and it was a completely greenfield project. We had zero code, nothing, zero, which is both awesome because you are starting fresh. You have nothing to worry about. Like, you don't have any legacy code you're going into, so you're just bringing all your ideas forward. It was a domain in a business that I was completely unfamiliar with for the most part, so there was a lot of learning, but it was exciting and scary at the same time. So it was a startup as well. So there was only 4 of us when this started. Most of the projects I worked on, however, throughout the last 18, 19 years, have been a combination of either greenfield that went absolutely nowhere and the projects went nowhere, or living in consulting and getting thrown into a lot of existing projects where things weren't going so well, or just kind of in maintenance mode, if you will. So this talk is actually kind of in both, in where some of the techniques and kind of the code structures and patterns I'm going to show are really applicable to both. Whether you're starting something new, whether you're in an existing system and you want to kind of move your application forward with the times, if you want to move to, for example, .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, or keep up with different technologies because you see the benefits there. Everything I'm talking about is really kind of a way to get there. So the app I was working on, or I am working on now, is a .NET backend. That's a combination of right now, it's full framework and some .NET Core. Primarily it's just an HTTP API. So it's basically just one web API. But we have a ton of clients for it. We have an ASP.NET Core, we have multiple ASP.NET Core clients that are front ends to this. There's a mobile app in Xamarin that we have. There's a web app using TypeScript, and there's some native Windows apps as well. So there's a lot we control. Thankfully, we control all these apps as well. So this is all still public or private, internal. So we control the clients as well as the back end. But this kind of poses some challenges in the whole mix. But primarily what I'm talking about is just the back end and how to keep this thing living over time, where it's maintainable, it's interchangeable to a certain degree, and then you can evolve it. It's a pretty important word there, just evolving it. So when I see a lot of sample apps, demo apps, I mean, obviously they're little demo apps, so they kind of just, if you're talking about MVC, for example, everything has the same, I'd say, 4 components that any normal app has at a bare minimum. Unfortunately, the demo apps, I think, especially for beginners, or even if you're just getting into something new like MVC or ASP.NET Core, you kind of take these little small samples and demo apps, and then you start there. That's wonderful. And then you take everything that they did in it, and it just grows over time, which isn't so great. So something like authorization is really typical, if you see in ASP.NET, is using attributes for authorization a lot of times. That's just, I think, probably the way I've seen it 90% of the time is with attributes. There's nothing wrong with it, but there's other ways, obviously, you can deal with authorization. Data access, so whether you're using Entity Framework or NHibernate or using straight ADO.NET or using Dapper or your whatever you're doing, there's something living somewhere. Even if it's, which I was loving the build announcements about Cosmos and formerly DocumentDB, because I think it's awesome. Whatever tool you're using, Mongo, whatever data storage you're using, you're having data access somewhere. And most times, again, this either consists of some repository, some generic repository, or just straight data access calls in a controller action. Validation. So this one's a little bit interesting here because I think there's a real confusion between what I call validation versus, say, domain logic, business logic. And what I'm really talking about is just kind of the superficial stuff, like an email looks valid, or something has a particular length of characters. Superficial stuff. Again, this oftentimes would be something that you would see in a combination of ways, something with either, again, like it could be attributes or through the Fluent API with entity framework, or you could be using something like Fluent validation. There's different kind of methods to this madness, but they're all kind of got the same thing when you see some of the sample apps, is always everything's together. And here's the heart of the stuff that I always live in all the apps I've lived in, because they're usually really, they're a line of business apps, but there's always some real core part of it. That's what's running the business, and there's a ton of this stuff, whether you realize it's there or not, there's a ton of it. And this, unfortunately, is most of the time what you don't see in the demo apps, unfortunately, which is really pretty much the reason why you're writing software to begin with. So this is what I hate about samples, is they have zero concern about responsibilities. And I get it. Like, I've written so many sample apps, and like even stuff on my own blog, that's because like who's going to take the time to spend 4 months or whatever writing a sample app? Like, it's just, you're not going to do it. So I do it all the time where I'm writing a blog post. Okay, this is this way. You wouldn't do this in production, but it's this way. And if I say that half the time, I don't even know. You just take it for granted that somebody's actually going to realize that. But I don't think a lot of the times we do, especially early on. Like, I think of myself early on, really sample apps and code samples that I've seen. Stack Overflow didn't exist yet, but on forums, etc., it's the kind of the mentality now, right? To a certain degree, it's like the copy and paste developer, which is somewhat concerning. So that's why I wish there was just more better samples. I'm going to show one that's actually okay, but I'm still going to butcher it up in this demo here. So just too many mixed responsibilities. And I think this is the crux of every application I've ever worked on, is mixed responsibilities and coupling. It's pretty much it that ruins everything for me, is those two. So where this tends to lead to, and I went down this path, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this, I'm just going to give an alternate to this, is the layered approach, where we're going to take all these mixed responsibilities and we're going to segregate these things into either, if you're living in Visual Studio, you're going to be living in different projects per se. You might have everything in kind of this, I mean, originally this is how the sample app is, right? You kind of just have, maybe these are even by folder to some degree, but they're all living in the same project, they're also living in the same assembly. Like I said, it's kind of a disaster. So this is where I typically see it go, which is auth will still live here in the ASP.NET. And that's primarily because of the simplicity of the attributes and kind of the whole authorization system. And then business logic and data access, and then subsequently a database. So what I always love about this one is a project that will be a data access layer that is really just a reference entity framework and a bunch of data models, or an EDMX or something. And then this business logic layer really isn't nothing more than kind of a gateway, if you will. But the idea is basically that you're going to have dependencies going from this way across. And I think a lot of this stems from some of the, a while ago, maybe like 10 years ago now, this kind of general notion of separating data access from business logic, and then from your front end. In theory, I think this actually is, for the most part, a good idea. Where I think this kind of falls over a lot is there still ends up being a lot of stuff in here, into the ASP.NET project, specifically some of the authorization stuff. So I'm going to show samples of, like, fake samples, but stuff that I legitimately would have wrote. So related to these layers. I would have in a business logic layer, related to any type of entity, whether that's like a product in this example, or maybe it's a customer, an order, whatever the case may be. I have a thing called like a manager. Really, so what this manager is provided a lot of kind of CRUD behavior, so the add, update, delete. And then things like more behavioral type methods, so like increasing inventory, decreasing inventory. But the key thing here is constantly generally passing around this object, this product, or like the product inventory. And really those things were nothing more than data buckets. They were, I mean, at this time when I was doing this type of thing, we weren't even using entity framework, so this was just really just a class with getters and setters on it for properties. They had no behavior inside of them. I think that's where, has anybody heard the term anemic domain model? A term? So where that comes from is the idea of it's being an any pattern, which is the idea that that product is an entity, is a domain entity, that you have a domain model, but you don't, because there's no behavior in it. It's just a data bucket, right? And there's really nothing wrong with it. This actually worked out really well for us. We kept this really consistent and tried as much as we could to create more of these type of methods that were more behavior driven, rather than, I mean, maybe having the product have the quantity, or some case maybe in just everything being CRUD. If we stuck a lot more behavior in here, it was a little bit better. But a key thing in this is there was no cohesion behind these things. Like, you could have made all these things static and it would have been fine, right? It was more procedural than anything, which has its place, and that, for the most part, this project that we did this on actually worked out pretty well to a certain degree. So this is something that would be in our data access layer. So again, we weren't using entity framework at the time. This would be same thing, CRUD. And what I loved about these things, like, this is a terrible sample, because these would generally have about, I don't know, like 20 or 30 methods on them. And most of them were named identically almost, and had a ton of overloads, until somebody created one that essentially replicated link to a certain degree, right? Like, it was find by name, find by SKU, find by this, a ton of different finds, and all they were really doing underneath the hood was just doing a query slightly differently. And what's really interesting here is, besides maybe like the get by ID, oftentimes, especially when Visual Studio introduced, I think it's called Code Lens, where it shows like the number of references. I don't know if that's a ReSharp or Visual Studio thing, but it'll show like the number of references a method has. And you'd look, when that feature came out and you'd look at this, you'd see like one reference. Because somebody needed some particular set of data, or they just needed, like, maybe not even the full product, maybe they just need something from the product. And if they were new, or even if they weren't new, my experience would be, okay, let me go look at the repository, what's in there. I don't have time to look to see what's close, and I have no idea what this API does, so I'm just going to create another method. And then you probably create something that said that was almost probably identical to something else that was already in there. So these end up being pretty cumbersome, because they end up just getting really, really large. And the same type of thing, this is just very procedural. All these things could be static. The only thing they shared, if anything, was probably a database connection. There was really nothing shared between them. Like, there's nothing behind them. So the biggest problem we had in this app of just having those three layers of MVC, data access, and our business logic layer, and this is when we were doing, like we were using Razor and everything, was making a small change. Like, nobody said it for the longest time, where making a small change was straight just painful. Like, it's like one of those things where you're working, you're doing stuff day to day, you get into the routine of things, and then it's a small change, like, hey, you just need to add some new data piece that belongs to a product that we now need to show on the screen. And you're like, all right, well, now I gotta go change the model, I got to go into the repository and make a change there. And especially if these are separate projects. So I'm jumping in through this project. I'm going to the manager, then I'm looking to see where that relevant change has to happen. Going to the controller and however many actions this relates to, which probably just likely isn't just that file, it's probably more than that. And then subsequently all the different views that I need to change. So whether it's displaying something, editing something, updating something, if you think about general CRUD here, it's like we added a column. Like, how did this take hours to add a column? Like, it feels like this isn't right. Like, I feel like we're taking a step back if this is what the case is. But it was one of those things where I was just like, okay, we're doing this works, things are good, the app's working, like, so what if it takes me 2 hours to make a small change? Like, it doesn't feel that bad. But it was painful. We all think the exact same thing. And I did this for years without really even acknowledging the pain. But what's interesting was, like, I never really even thought of why code was organized the way it was. Like, why, if we're talking about MVC, for example, like, why controllers were together? Why are models together? Why are views stored together? Why is everything organized by a technical concern? My only answer for that was, well, I had two. One was because that's what the templates in Visual Studio made for me. I previously, before .NET, was in Python a lot, and that's how other frameworks were doing things. Pretty much everything was that way for the most part. It still is. Even when you do file a new project right now in .NET Core, MVC, you're getting a grouping with their templates. But I never understood why. Like, what was the reason why I was doing it this way? Sure, that's what the project templates are doing, but why? Like, what exactly is the reason? Has anybody actually thought about this? Why everything's organized this way? Do you have a reasonable, like, to yourself? I don't have the answer. I'm just like, I'm curious.
I've spent a fair amount of time doing this. I've done a lot of greenfield, lots of contracts, and what do you call it? Taking like instruction from folks that do this for a living, like as technical architects, and you're right. It does organize around technical concerns. The way that I typically lay it out is usually by layer and then by stack.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's right. It
Yeah.
works. There is the pain of modeling, doing the MVVM mapping all the way through.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's right.
Yeah, I just think about how long I did it. Like, there was I blogged about that. I'm trying to remember who did this, but somebody made a comment of the exact same thing, where if you start a project, right, and you do file new project, and you get your layout, and say you're working on this for any decent amount of time, right? Like, even I'm going to be showing the Music Store MVC app from a couple of years ago that they ported to .NET Core, that's what I'm kind of working on. But if you look at the actual solution itself, and everything's organized by controllers, views, models, everything. There's like a services folder, I think. And then you were to open up, say, just any other MVC app, you can probably get the gist of like what the app does as a whole, but I really don't know if you'd be able to say what actual like functionality exists within the, like, okay, there's a shopping cart controller. Okay, there's an account controller. Well, like, what okay, so like I can manage user accounts? Like, what actual functionality, what are actually all the use cases? You see none of the use cases because everything's just organized the same way. How is it that I'm creating an app in transportation and you're creating an app in healthcare and they look the same? That's what I thought originally. I was like, how does that make any sense? That we organize stuff the same way? Like, how would your app and my app have the same organization structure? Shoot.
It's not based off separation of concern regarding the architecture. Yeah, so you know that the views are here. Yeah, so when people rediscover MVC, that's actually quite old. It started from Smalltalk.
Yep.
Yeah, so then they realize that you have this separation of concerns, but you're right, you don't see the features.
Yeah. Yeah, I can get behind that. I can get behind like what's the concern, like views, controllers, etc. My biggest thing with that is, and this is the whole talk really, so I don't want to give it all away, is kind of like in this situation when I was talking about like number of references and things, and most of the time in most of the apps that I see, there's almost a one-to-one relationship between things. Most of the time, there's a view model that pertains to a view, which pertains to a controller action. Like it's usually a one-to-one-to-one. So I think that's where all the painting that I was talking about comes from, is just this idea of, like I have all these things that are one-to-one-to-one, but I'm jumping through projects to get to everything. So yeah, this is the template. This is like brand new file, new project in ASP.NET Core, and that's what you get right now. It's controllers, models, views, and yeah, like your shared stuff is all in there. But this is the typical stuff. Does anybody work in something other than .NET? No, we're at a .NET user group, so.
We'd stone them if they were.
What's that?
We'd stone them if they were.
Yeah. Get out of here. You do or don't?
I do have other languages that
Yeah.
work in.
Is everything scaffold like that initially?
The one language that I'm currently working in is like weird. Does anybody know what Progress or 4GL is?
Yeah.
Okay,
So
it's
that's
very procedural.
Yeah.
Sorry I even said it.
Yeah, like I haven't been keeping up to date in terms of other server-side stuff too much. I know in some of the, I'm going to choose my words carefully here, some of the Angular stuff that I've seen, it is not organized like this. Even though, yeah, you're not using MVC and they call controller something that I don't think is a controller, but you don't generally organize it this way, which I think is interesting too. So I go back to, I really got big into kind of onion architecture around when I started getting into domain-driven design. Anybody interested in domain-driven design? I highly recommend checking out the book if you haven't. So about that time, in that book, Eric talked a lot of the stuff about entities, and the general idea here is really just having dependencies pointing in. So we're talking about the web, right? You have the web, you have controllers, everything just basically pointing in. So this core part of your app has no dependencies on anything. This is just straight objects that contain behaviors, like in the true OO sense of the word, that encapsulate data. That's really kind of the idea of having everything pointing in. And I think you're kind of getting there with even just some of the little bit different of a versus what I was showing earlier. Like the difference between that diagram and stuff like this is this could take the behavior. These should have contained the behavior. Like this is what would have been in the core, is those products, is those actual domain models. So there's a dozen different ways you can technically do this, but just the idea is that dependencies are basically flowing in. And the big thing here is the web being on the outermost edge and not containing any of the inside stuff. But the whole point of all of that is just to minimize your coupling on the framework, especially on something like MVC. And that's where I got into trouble a lot, was just having too much coupling on ASP.NET, having my attributes defined in my controllers for authentication, having, for example, some of like even the validation on some of the entity framework models. So whether it be entity framework, like your data access framework, or whether it be your web framework, just having too much reliance on them and coupling to them. I mean, obviously you want to maximize how you're using them, but my biggest thing is keep your app, and let the framework that you use, like, don't let it get in your way, and minimize your coupling to it. So that's really important, because in every app that I've ever worked on, it generally starts out as, yes, it's a web app, like we're creating it in ASP.NET, but it's really not a web app. It's really an app that we're developing that has a set of capabilities that the interface to it is the web. And it may not only be the web. In every app I've ever worked on, that has always been the case over time, which is we want another input to it rather than just HTTP. So instead of it just being HTTP only, you're going to want other input sources, at least I have. There's a lot of circumstances where we've created different apps where, yeah, it really just only needed to be a web app, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think there gets to a point, too, where once you start seeing other sources come in related to, I don't know, whether you have, I think I have a slide on this next, whether you have like background processes that need to run, that you want to execute something. The way I used to have to alternately do this was create cron jobs or scheduled tasks that makes HTTP requests, right? That's how you execute something. But that's just because the only mechanism we had to do anything was HTTP, because we were running everything in ASP.NET. Everything was coupled to ASP.NET. So that's really what goes back to this, is just minimizing our coupling to ASP.NET, minimizing our coupling to whatever our front end is, which is really just the I/O. So if we were going to do that, the way this started off was, well, first how? Like, how do we keep our app, and how do we invoke our app, and just the different use cases? Like, if you think of a controller action as a use case, or a portion of a use case, that's kind of the input and output. How do we limit what's actually inside of that? Like, I want that controller to be as slim as possible, to contain almost nothing. I just want to take the initial request, let MVC do its job, and offload that somewhere else. So I don't have to have anything in MVC per se. So with the layered approach, like I said, MVC, what this probably would look like would be MVC, you have a controller action, maybe it's just you're getting out a product or something. It would use the product repository, get a product out, maybe you then convert that to some view model, maybe fetch some other extra data that you add to the view model. Then you pass that to Razor and then out you go. And then on the way in, if you're getting some data request, you're probably doing the same thing, but then calling some other thing to mutate its state, like in that business logic layer. And that thing may use the data access, maybe it spits something back that you call then to the data access. But generally the idea being is that everything ultimately lives in here. Like all the organization, all the invoking is happening here, which is what I wanted to completely get away from. So I love the idea of the web of just like request response. So how do we do the same type of thing? How do I create some uniform API that really this represents, this uniform API represents my app, and then I can leave my controllers just do the minimum possible thing. And for me that is serializing. So if I'm returning like XML or JSON or something, like I want to deal with that. I want it to deal with the incoming payloads and deserialize them for me. Things like your cookies, your whatever authentication that you want to pass in. Trying to think of the routing, obviously, to where a request is happening at. But how do I create a uniform API? So about the time I was getting into domain-driven design, it seems like once you get into it in hand, you ultimately hit up reading about CQRS. Anybody know CQRS? Heard the acronym before? Yeah. So it's not complicated. It's so simple. I think it's got like a total bad rap for overcomplicated diagrams that I've even created. Because once you start using CQRS, it tends to evolve into other things. But Greg is the one that coined the term with Udi Dahan, and Greg wrote this on his blog, saying that it's just the separation of reads and writes. So if you're mutating state, it's a command. If you're returning state, it's a query. That's it. That's as simple as it gets. That there's nothing else involved. Like if you're thinking of the my repository or my business logic. It's if you have something that's changing state, we'll keep those things in one class. If you have something that's going to return data, have it in another class. That's as simple as it gets. If you're doing that, you're doing CQRS. Unfortunately, this is the diagram. I think like this, I don't know, I created this slide quite a while ago, but if you type CQRS or something of that nature and go to Google Images, you'll find this one. And this article in itself wasn't that bad. But I find with every article, they tend to throw a lot of other things in the mix here. Like they're talking about more than just CQRS. So CQRS does not require you to have a command bus. It does not require you to have a command handler. It does not require you to have a domain model. Or in this case, this article was also talking about event sourcing and an event store. Then having another event that you're pushing your events to in that bus, and having this general loop that you'll see quite often when people are talking about CQRS. But they're not, like this is not CQRS. This is a combination of, this is CQRS because you will have commands going on one side and queries going on the other side. But there's nothing stopping you from doing CQRS and having one database. There's absolutely nothing stopping you from doing that. There's a domain-driven design, actually there's a CQRS event sourcing Google group, and periodically, I don't know how often, I don't know if he has this on a timer, Greg Young will throw a message in the group saying, just a friendly reminder that you don't need two databases anytime you do this, because it seems like it always gets convoluted into this all the time. You just separate reads and writes and you're doing it. But the thing is, it's like, that sounds really simple, and it is. But once you start doing it, even if you are doing it, and you think about the possibilities, this could be a possibility. There's a whole lot going on here, but yeah, the possibilities of deciding how you want to separate and how you want to handle reads versus writes becomes pretty opening in terms of what you can do from there. So with CQRS, what I start thinking about is, okay, I'm just going to have my controller that's ultimately just going to make a request, and within that request, that's actually where I want my layers to live. I want a request to contain my authorization, my business logic, and my data access. So everything that I was talking about before, that was like this application-wide layering system, I'm now taking down to the unit of a request. So whether it can be a command or a query, I'm thinking, no, not layers application-wide. I'm talking about layers within an actual individual request. So this is pretty profound when you start thinking about everything that you have. And if you were to take, when I was saying I had a repository that had one method, that had one usage, where would that usage live? Here, basically. So in order to do this with CQRS, one way of doing this, just one way of doing it, is with the Mediator pattern. And it's really simple. So I kind of thought about this a while ago. It took me a while to kind of come to this. I didn't even know what the name of the pattern was originally. It took me quite a while to figure out what this was actually called. But it's the idea that you have an object that understands how to interact with other objects. So rather than you have, like if you have an object A that takes a dependency on object B, and you're going to invoke some method on object B, yes, you have a direct coupling to object B. Even at worst, you maybe have an interface to it, but you still have some direct coupling to it. What the Mediator is doing for you, though, is completely removing that dependency. Like you no longer know the receiver of that call on the other side. So you no longer know about the object that you're actually invoking. So what that looks like is you take a dependency on the Mediator. So if you have your controller, for example, or any class you can do this with, you're taking a dependency on the Mediator, and then you're going to be sending a message to the Mediator, and it understands the receiver on the other end, how to construct it, how to evoke it, and if there's a result, how to return, like to take that result and return it back to you. So you're basically completely removing the coupling that you have on object B. So, has anybody used AutoMapper before, or heard of AutoMapper? Yeah, some. So AutoMapper is a library for mapping objects, basically from one to the other. And you can create different rules. It's a pretty cool project. But Jimmy Bogart is the one who created it, and he also created this library called Mediator, which is slightly, I think he just released somewhat of a new version a couple months ago of it, but it's been getting really popular now. And I'm going to be showing basically it, but there's other alternatives to this if this doesn't, like the syntax of it doesn't exactly fit how you like. There's kind of variations of this, but essentially they're all the Mediator pattern at the end of the day. And the key thing about everything I'm showing is this is all in process. So everything you're doing is executing in process just like you would be normally creating MVC. There's nothing out of process here. There's nothing going like to a bus or anything. It's all in process. So the app I'm going to show is the ASP.NET MVC Music Store. So originally this was created, I think, well, originally it says it's built in MVC 3, but they did port this to .NET Core. So I took this probably about a year ago and just started converting some of it. So I just wanted something that was pretty in line with what I was talking about at the very beginning, which is like not as, I mean, this one's bigger than most sample apps, but it's really not too complicated. But everything that I was talking about originally, this is the epitome of, where everything's pretty much in a controller, for the most part. There's some logic living elsewhere, like related to the cart, but to say convert this thing into ASP.NET Core, like if to go from MVC 3 or 4 or 5, wherever they moved it up to, and to say to convert this to ASP.NET Core, would be pretty painstaking, I would think. Because I mean, is anybody using ASP.NET Core? MVC yet? Liking it?
There's some wrinkles.
Yeah. Does it feel the same-ish?
Yeah.
But for the most part, I feel like it's somewhat the same. But there's still, some of the semantics are a little bit different. So like it's not like you can just 100% copy paste this stuff. Like say, hey, here's a controller action, I'm just gonna copy and paste this. It's not really happening that way. So if you have an app bigger than this one, which I certainly do, this exactly wouldn't be like a task that I would want to do, move it to .NET Core. Like I wouldn't be raising my hand to do it, it'd be pretty painstaking. But anyways, they did the early lifting at the pretty early in the ASP.NET Core days. Like before I think they even hit 1, I think this was converted. So I remember using it, I started doing this then, and it was pretty rough in pre.NET Core. Did anybody hear the news about some of the plans for .NET Core 3 and moving WPF and Windows Forms and UWP, which is pretty interesting, I thought. I'm seeing like, what? Good news, bad news? Is it like, so the holdout, like is anybody holding out on .NET Core? I'm just curious. Yeah, like for...
You cannot change now.
Yeah, like there's just too much in
So many projects are dependencies.
Yeah.
We like to do it.
Yeah. Well, the really interesting that they showed in one of the demos, they showed like a WinForm app that they created that was basically just looking at the file system, and it just showed like a little Telerik kind of pie chart, and it showed like just the disk space usage of all the folders. And what I found unbelievable was that the .NET, the WinForm running on .NET Core was twice as fast, showing that, like reading through the file system just because of the runtime itself is faster. So I can only imagine, like I haven't written a WinForm or WPF in a while, but I can only imagine how beneficial that would be to people of being able to use the latest and greatest in the runtime. That's my only reason to move stuff to core. Like we move quite a bit of stuff over is just the performance gains basically. That's pretty much it. Like I don't feel like there's anything.
What about cross-plat? going to
Well,
containers?
I shouldn't say that. That's the big one. But even then, like I should look at our pricing. But like in terms of like running like a Windows cluster in say Docker versus like a Linux one, I don't know what the price difference is. Like if we were, because like we have stuff that runs in .NET Core and like in a cluster in Linux, but I don't know like what the price difference would be if we were running it in Windows or not.
Is there like, because like the Docker containers for ASP.NET and the one for the Linux is it's like multi-tagged more or less, depending on how you use it is which OS you use, and I think I don't think there's any difference.
Yeah, I don't know. Can't say. I'm on another cloud provider other than Azure, so I don't don't tell anybody. Yeah. But yeah, I would say the cross-plat is an interesting reason. I don't know if I always thought, it is to me, because my background originally wasn't Windows, so I don't know, I think it's really cool. Like I love the Windows subsystem for Linux. I think it's awesome. But I don't know, I'd be curious of like how many people actually care about it running cross-plat. Like does that matter to you guys that like it can run cross-plat, or you'd be running it on Windows anyways?
It's fun to run it on Linux, just saying.
Yeah.
I love me some Bash shell.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's good either way. I mean, we have somebody on our team that's on a Mac all day, and he never wants to go in his Windows partition, basically. But he's doing our Xamarin stuff most of the time, so he can live in VS for Mac. So it's all good. But yeah, if he has to do some of the other stuff, he has to jump back over, and we hear about it every day on Slack that he had to move over, and he's not happy about it. So Mediator pattern, get back to what I was talking about. It's kind of, the way we use this is in a combination of also the command pattern, which is really just the idea of encapsulating all the information that you require for a request, for an action. So if you were to think about just a method, and you think about the parameters in a method, take all those parameters out, create an object that represents that, there you go, command pattern. So this mediator pattern is basically using the command pattern at the same time here, just to represent the request. And this is what kind of gives us ultimately this really uniform request that we can use over and over again, because every request just basically has the same interfaces. So the way this is going to look with the Mediator library is we're going to have ASP.NET, we're going to have our controllers. It's going to depend on the Mediator. It's going to send a request to the Mediator. The Mediator, at the end of the day, is going to understand who the recipient is, which is basically one for a request. There's only ever one handler for that request. So a request, again, it's just an object that you have, and there's going to be one handler, which the Mediator is going to construct. And it's basically going to pass that object to that handler. So instead of object A calling a method on object B, you're really constructing an object, passing it to the Mediator, and it's going to subsequently do everything. The thing with Mediator is it ultimately uses you will use some DI container with it, and you'll basically tell it how to resolve the appropriate handlers, because your handlers are obviously going to have dependencies too. So it's really generic though, and it can work with anything. If you're using ASP.NET Core, he's got something built into it as well that uses the new dependency injection extensions, or whatever the new Microsoft kind of DI is. But whether you use like structure map or whatever, I don't know what everybody else uses, but it's all there. So, and this is also when we were talking about packages and dependencies, I was thinking about that today. Is I'm actually surprised how many dependencies or how many packages on NuGet actually target .NET Standard now, which I think really helps the idea of being able to move. There's some ones that we use are giant roadblocks, but I think most are getting there, and it's .NET Standard. So you can actually use this anywhere. This doesn't need to be MVC. This can be WPF. This can be. We actually use this in Xamarin too. So this is the. What time do you want me to stop at, Ken?
Whenever you're at a natural birth.
We'll stop her here.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
because I'm gonna get into a bunch of code.
Okay, so it's 7:24, so we'll reconvene around 7:30. If anybody doesn't know where the washrooms are, just head back out towards the doors. Before you get to the checkout desk, make a left and right by the photocopier system. Washrooms there. There's more pizza and more talk back here, so please help yourself.